all scenes in memoirs have a place. They have to. Sometimes it's implied. Sometimes maybe it's not that important. But they all have to happen in some real place. Sometimes beginning memoir writers will forget either to state where that place is, so we know that anything that happens after is occurring in that location, or they're a little bit confused as to where each character was. And this is a good example of that from one of my students. Let me just read this out. We hadn't really discussed our plans for Christmas morning, but I figured it would be the usual thing. When I woke up on Christmas morning, my brother was still asleep. We had spent the night at my dad's house. I tried to wake him up, but he wanted to sleep, so I left him. I went downstairs to find my dad, but he wasn't home. I called him, and he was at his girlfriend's house for breakfast with some family and friends. He told me to wake Dominic up and come up there, but I didn't really feel like it. My mom was home alone, so I drove to her house. She lived close to my dad's. When I go there, nobody was home. I called here, and she was at Auntie Pam's house having breakfast with her. So in addition to some grammatical errors that need to be cleaned up, do you notice how many locations were there? But she doesn't actually state the location at the beginning, the one that she was in, on Christmas morning. So after the second sentence, we still don't know exactly where she woke up on Christmas morning. Then she says, we had spent the night at my dad's house. Oh, okay. But I think to keep the logic here, we should know she's at her dad's house before Christmas morning. Saying it after is somewhat confusing. And then we're going to see after that, there's all these other locations. And then Dad wasn't at this house, but he was at his girlfriend's house. And then the father says for them to come to the girlfriend's house. But then my mom was home alone, so I drove to her house. She lived close to my dad's, but she got there and nobody was home. And actually she was at Auntie Pam's house. So I don't know how many is that? 5 different locations here? Very confusing. We need to establish the locations earlier in the story, or maybe if this was a part of a book, we would know about Auntie Pam's house. We would know Dad's house. All this would already have been set up before we get into this paragraph. But really here, location is not stated right away. And then after that, there's just too many locations for a reader to possibly follow. So simplify, state it early, and it'll make sense to the reader.